the first one is that the oil, like paint is made of usually linseed, sometimes walnut oil, pigment. So the oil being the base of oil painting. Normally they take industrially extracted oils and they alkali refine them, which usually involves heat and chemical inside. It's a pretty abrasive process. We do it the old-fashioned way, so basically we take the cold-pressed oil, so it's a more expensive pressing of the oil, and then we clean it with water and minerals, and it takes about 2 months. And it generally should get an oil that has a little bit more body, a little bit paler, and dries a little bit faster than the industrial oils. Now, I was saying a second ago that they are edible, but the stuff you get in the stores is usually raw. And raw usually means it has a lot of kind of food and nutrients in it. And those nutrients will eventually, when they would spoil, would turn brown, which is not what you want for your oil paint. And would also slow the drying, which is not what you want for your oil paint. So when oils are cleaned, you're basically removing all the things that are embedded in the oil.
The omega-3 fatty acids.
And so as you can see, you make a linseed oil. This is a walnut oil and a linseed oil. They're usually a little bit paler than what you'll find. Sometimes there's a little bit of variation in batches because we do get like a cold pressing direct from a farm in the Dakotas, and then depending on the minerals and the season, that's the main thing. So we're the only ones that basically take a cold pressed oil and clean it without chemicals.
Right. And this is how it was done by the old masters. Everyone did this themselves. I mean, maybe when colormen became more common, colormen would probably offer a product like this that someone would clean, that they would clean, or someone would clean for them. But most artists, this was part of their studio practice, to clean the oil themselves.
And there was discussions of cleaning the oils when oil painting developed as far back as about the 13th and 14th century. And they talked about it a lot. I mean, since people started buying products in stores, they don't talk about it a lot because they're not having to make their own materials. But for about 500 years ago, they talked about it incessantly because they couldn't just go to a store and buy it. And they were constantly worried about how fast was it going to dry and how dark was it going to be. The second thing that we do that's different than other companies is that we do not use turpentine, and we do not use odorless petroleum mineral spirits, which would be Gamsol, turpentine. Any of the odorless solvents you buy are basically 100% distilled petroleum, like gasoline, except that it's hyper refined and they take out the smell. Spike oil, which is the main solvent we use, mixed in our mediums, sold by itself and making the varnishes. There's records of it being used by Da Vinci and as early as the 14th century. And it was used in the same way people use solvents now. They want to clean things, clean their brushes, clean their palettes, make their varnishes, thin the mediums, make the paint a lot looser. The reason we use it mostly was from self-preservation, is because since we're having to handle it, it works just as well. We think at times better, but it's historically documented, and it's non-carcinogenic. So it does have a smell because it's basically very concentrated lavender, but it does not cause a lot of the respiratory issues, and it's not cancer causing. That being said, like with any solvent, and for that matter, even if you're cooking in your kitchen, ventilation is always recommended. You don't want to be painting in oils regardless of what you're using in a tiny sealed room.
Right.
Everyone needs fresh air. Right. But most people like the smell. Some people find it a little bit strong. Lavender you might find in aromatherapy and other things as well in pure concentration, but normally you're only using a tiny bit of it. There's about 30 types of lavender that are commercially used. Spike is the one that was traditionally used, perhaps because that was what was available, meaning that was the plants that were nearby in Italy in 1400s, 1500s. But it does have a sharper smell than some of the lavenders you're more used to. So basically, we naturally clean the oils, and the solvents are non-carcinogenic. And then we have two brush cleaning solvents, like I was explaining earlier. One is from distilled orange peels. It's actually a byproduct of the orange juice industry. After they peel the oranges to make the orange juice, then they have these organic matter, and they distill it, and they sell it to be used, and people use it in all sorts of products, food, cleaners to make sense. We sell it at 100% concentration. It's a very strong cleaner. It smells very strong as orange. You'll be able to come up and smell it at the end of this as well. I'll demonstrate cleaning brushes with it. They actually clean the brushes a lot faster than odorless petroleum mineral spirits. They won't necessarily separate overnight like the petroleum will, but even if it's dirty or in terms of color, you can keep reusing it day after day. There's no reason really to throw this out. And even with the spike, if you have some that's dirty and you can put it into your brush cleaning jar or something like this, whatever you use, and you can keep using it to clean your brushes day after day. The reason we use a solvent to clean your brushes is because any paint that's absorbing into the brush hairs, drying on the brush hairs, has gotten to ferrule. Just cleaning your brush at the end of the day with walnut oil or soap and water isn't going to get it clean. So the solvent, which is actually, even though it's stronger for cleaning, it's gentler and less abrasive to the hairs on the brush. It will get all the stuff that's partially drying and is really embedded in the paintbrush out. And then we have an all-natural olive oil soap. So it's an old-fashioned 19th century recipe for oil-based soap. It's about 85% olive oil, and just like people need to condition your hair, it does the same thing. It replenishes the moisture in the hairs, and also takes out any remaining pigment. We really want to take your questions about the materials, if you've used them or not, or the questions you have about usage, and then again, oil painting materials in general. But again, so we have the two oils, linseed and walnut, which we sell actually we do sell this at the store as well. It has the two oils, linseed and walnut. It has the two mediums, lean or fat, which is based on the idea of painting fat over lean, and we can talk about that. So we sell the solvent by itself, then the varnish that's made with that solvent, the spike. And here we have the brush cleaning, the lavender brush cleaner, and then a small bar of soap. And so this pack they sell has pretty much everything we make in small quantities, but it allows you to try things before in case you're interested.
How are we doing, guys?
Good.
Very good. How are you?
Good.
I want to make just one general statement about studio practice in terms of solvents. If you're painting, you should be in the habit of, if you're using oil-based solvents, you should be in the habit of covering your container when you're painting, right? So you don't want to be standing over an open container, having it off gas onto you while you're working. So if you're working 7-8 hours a day over an open can of turpentine, you're going to develop an issue. It may take a long time. I have some friends who've developed issues with turpentine, after 20 years, some after 5 years. So it hits everybody differently. Turpentine off gases at a pretty high rate, right? So it evaporates quickly. So does the spike oil. It has almost the same evaporative quality, which is the quality that you want from a solvent when you're painting with oil paint. Now, odorless mineral spirits, as a comparison, is really the same thing. They just put something in it so that it evaporates a little bit slower. So
in the past, when a lot of people go to art school, everyone would have a coffee can or a jar, and they're swirling it around using it as a medium and using it excessively, which has its issues. And then there are 30 people in a closed room, and people are getting sick. To replace that, they came out with odorless petroleum mineral spirits, which basically doesn't smell, so people don't complain as much, but it only evaporates at a third of the rate of turpentine. So it's not actually as effective as solvent. And they do say it's safer because you're breathing at a slower rate. It's only a third of it's evaporating at the same amount of time, but it's still carcinogenic and brings lots of issues.
exactly. So whether you're using turpentine, which I guess at this point not very many people do, although I used to love the properties of turpentine, and I used it for 20 years before OMS before you couldn't use it anymore at any of the schools, so you had to go to OMS. When I started using spike oil, I started feeling, well, this is the same properties that turpentine used to have. Get yourself a good container that has a nice sealing lid that even if you don't snap it down, when you put it on there, it seals pretty well.
The one that everyone uses, which is the odorless petroleum, is incredibly weak compared to almost all other solvents. But that's the one that everyone's used to using. But
And it's the one that the schools use.
Right, and they let you use it because, again, it evaporates at a slow rate, and people don't complain because they can't smell it, but it still has a lot of issues. And again, the practice of using so much solvent when you're painting is actually not very good for the painting because it cleans, it breaks up the oil pigment bond. And if you're using it excessively with your paints, then it breaks up the pigment from the oil dives into the pores, leaves the pigment on top with not enough oil, which is your glue, your binder. And a lot of times people will see the painting's dry, they'll try and paint on the next day and they'll pick up the layer from the day before even though it's dry.
Or if you rub it with your finger, if you've ever had that experience where you've used a lot of solvent and then next day it's dry and you rub it with your finger and the pigment is really just powder on the surface of the canvas. That's because there's no binder left in it.
So we do try and, with the fat and lean mediums, both of them have 50% oil content. The idea being that you should have enough oil binder glue in your paints at all times. But that being said, if you want to make it leaner, you can either use less or add some more solvent, spike to it. And if you want to make it fatter, you can add some more oil to it, or you can even add a little bit of varnish. The varnish is, again, like tree sap. It's a little bit sticky, and so it's going to add a little bit of grip. And if some people like to paint where they do a first layer and it sets up very quickly, so by the end of the day it's a little bit tacky, then that, there's ways that you can use it for glazing or for quick sketches to use that properties. All right, so does anyone have any questions regarding what I just went over?
So the varnish dries flat?
Dries what?
Flat?
Flat.
Flat.
The more it's shiny.
The more you shine. Yeah. Generally, the resins are all shiny. Again, a varnish is made of a resin dissolved in a solvent. It turns into a liquid altogether solution. It's spread on, then the solvent evaporates and leaves the resin behind in the coat. But the resin itself is something that's almost always shiny. And if you want to make it not shiny, then there's things that you add to it. Historically, wax is sometimes added to it, and that makes it a little bit duller. And actually, talc powder. The problem is talc will sink to the bottom, so you have to keep it mixed really well and apply it. But that will actually take a little bit of the gloss off. I'm not recommending doing that. I've done it, but to get matte varnishes means that there's something added to it besides the resin and solvent.
You can also make it matte by using whole wax medium and buffing the surface after you varnish it. Yeah. So if you varnish it and it's very shiny and you want less shine or no shine, by putting whole wax medium on it and then buffing it the way you would a piece of furniture, you could bring it to any level of matte that you would want.
But it changes the color, doesn't it? The wax is a little yellow.
It's not that it's yellow, it's that it's less shiny. And so it's just like when you paint in oil and something sinks in and it looks paler and more washed out, and then if it gets wet looking with oil, medium varnish, it gets richer. The wax will bring down the shine.
You put the varnish on there as a protector, to even out the color as well and keep it rich. But it's protection that's removable, so that in the future, if there is a problem with dirt, grime, any impurities, it can be removed and then revarnished.
Any other questions?
All right. If you could go over the varnishing procedure, so if you've done, how long should oil paint oxidize before you apply it? What are the dangers of applying it too soon? If I don't want a total matte, I don't want a total gloss, I want something middle of the road, what would be the best way to balance that?
You sometimes do get this question where people will varnish a painting, and the painting might have even been dry for 6 months, and it'll take off a little bit of the painting. And so one or two people once called us and said, your varnish stripped my painting. The reason you let a painting dry 6 months traditionally was that it will cure, and then the varnish goes on as a separate layer, and the oil is permanent, and the varnish can be removed 50 years later with the solvent. The varnish is mostly made of solvent, so if the varnish is picking up any of the painting that should be dry after 6 months, it's because the painting was not painted with enough oil or binder. I sometimes recommend people not to, if they're not used to putting on varnishes, or they're not sure if their painting was painted with enough binder. Usually if it's shiny, you know it's painted with enough binder. But you can always do a test with like a little bit of cotton or a rag and a little bit of solvent and rub a corner and check. And if it's taking off any paint, your paint does not have enough binder oil in it to make it permanent. And any varnish you put on, ours or anyone else's, is going to strip some stuff off. So what I often recommend to people, if that situation arises, is either they can slightly rub some linseed oil onto the painting to kind of supplement it and seal it, or don't use our varnish or anyone else's varnish, use a spray varnish, because then you're not going to be rubbing. But as for why you varnish, when to varnish, I'm going to let Rick take that, and then I might supplement.
And just to add one thing to what he just said about spray varnishing, you're just postponing the inevitable. If you choose to spray varnish because something's coming off, you're just postponing that thing getting removed until that varnish is changed. If you're not planning on removing that varnish for 50 years, but someday someone's going to remove that varnish, they are going to remove that paint because there's not enough binder in the paint. It's going to come off when that paint is clean. So, and that's one of the problems with conservating, being a conservator of paintings, is that there's no way of knowing if there's an issue with that surface. No matter whose painting it is, when you clean it, you have to be super careful, and they are, because you just don't know what you're going to remove when you start putting solvent on a picture. And that's why they experiment with all different kinds of solvents, so that they impact the painting as minimally as possible. So, in terms of when to varnish, there's this traditional idea of 6 months. I really think that I think that's a great rule of thumb, because a company prints something like that on the bottle. I mean, they have no idea how you painted it. I do think it's a factor of how many layers you put on, how you paint, what things you use in the painting, how big are your impastos. Like, I think there's a lot that goes into that time frame. If you're somebody who's doing an olive prima picture that isn't painted incredibly thick, one layer, and you have plenty of oil in it, I don't think you have that big of a problem with varnishing it inside of 6 months. I mean, I probably wouldn't do it, a week later, but I would let a reasonable amount of time pass, maybe a month or so, 2 months, if it's just one layer, and not terribly thick. But if you're somebody who does 10 to 15 layers of glazing and scumbling and all sorts of complicated techniques and thin layers, you're creating a complicated layer structure on its own for you to keep track of, just making sure that things are fat and that they're binding to each other, each layer. In cases like that, I think that that 6 month number, potentially you could push that out to 9 months, depending on if you're painting it really fat, or if you're painting really thick, so not necessarily fat, but really thick, and then you're painting glazes, fat scumbles, fat glazes on top of that. I would. There could be paintings that need to go for a year or more before they get a varnish on. I've buffed with cold wax medium, and I think it's all about the amount that you put on there and the amount of buffing that you do. And it's not, I haven't had it look or feel waxy or sticky after I've done that. The cold wax mediums have like a dryer in them, so that they don't drop, they don't act like regular wax where it's constantly sort of a magnet for dust. So they do dry and eventually become dustable, let's say, where you're not, when you dust it, pushing whatever fell on it into the surface. So a lot of people, I think, maybe use the cold wax medium a little bit too heavily, and I think that a little bit pushed over the whole surface and then buffed to exactly the right consistency that you want, it disappears into the painting. And the cold wax mediums, if you look at them on the shelves, they're almost pure white. And when you get down to a thin enough film, you're not going to be yellowing the picture any more than nature will do.
And to make them easily spreadable, the wax is like a resin, is softened by heat, or it can be dissolved in a solvent. So if you need to liquefy it, you could add some salt. And if you wanted to make it, the wax felt like it was a little bit too, not hard, but just not soft enough, like the cream texture. If you warmed it, and as long as it retained the heat, it would spread a lot quicker. So they're actually, and if it does get too shiny, whether it's a varnish or something involving wax, you can remove it with solvent. Again, the issue being that you have to make sure the painting underneath had enough binding. And after this, we'll discuss a little bit the idea of painting fat over lean, and that will play into a little bit of understanding how you make sure that your final painting surface is archival in the sense that it's permanent. It's really clean. When you put a ground on, it has a certain level of absorbency, like how porous it is. If it's very porous, it's going to absorb oil and paint and pull it in. And each time you put a paint layer on, the surface below, depending on how porous it is going to suck in some of the oil. So if you were using the same fatness of medium day after day, what you have to keep in mind is that that depends very much on what was underneath the paint layer, because the paint is going to dry leaner than what it was when you applied it, because some of that oil, which is what makes it fat, gets absorbed underneath. You'll know that you would need to make your medium fatter depending on how you're painting. If you're having adhesion issues, or the paint is really sinking in, and then you'll know that you need to start adding more oil, or possibly a little bit of varnish to make it grab. But that's why, again, with the lean medium we have, it's just half oil, half solvent. So it's very easy to temper, but it depends on what your usage is and what your ground is and how thick you're painting and what your paints are. Because for us to say off the bat what the perfect medium is doesn't take into account what ground someone's using. And so for that reason, we're trying to keep the mixture very simple, so you can adjust according to how you paint and what other materials you're using. Lean, in terms of the liquid, is your solvent. Now we call it a solvent, but basically it's an essential oil. It's a volatile oil. It's an essence, it's a spirit. So in oil painting we talk about drying oils. We talk about oils, we mean drying oils, linseed, walnut. And we talk about solvents, we're talking about turpentine, or in our case spice or OMS. Those are also oils, but they're oils that evaporate. So if you think of this all as oil painting, possibly a better terminology would be drying oils and evaporating oils. But since everyone's used to oil and solvent, that's what we're going to stick with. Now basically what we associate is that oils are drying oils, that they dry and they're permanent. They're like the glue, the binder. And the solvents are essential oils. They disappear. You just use them to thin. And the idea is that you want to use enough binding oil, drying oil, linseed oil, to make it permanent, but you don't want to use too much, because then it's going to get greasy, it's going to take longer to dry, and too much oil eventually, everything, even our oils which are paler, everything to some way, shape, or form is going to yellow a little bit eventually. I'm going to yellow a little bit at some point. This paper, as bleached white as it is, at some point will get a little bit yellow. So nothing lasts for a million years. It's a question of degrees. And our oils, if you don't clean the oils, they'll turn brown or quite orange. Cleaned oils will definitely get quite yellow. Any cleaned oil will get a little bit yellower. Ours should be a little bit less because we really purified and got a lot of this stuff out. As far as fat over lean goes, oil is, you need it. It's really, really important. It's also the least toxic part of your whole painting process. It's edible, it doesn't give fumes. I mean, it has a little bit of an odor, but you know, it's non-toxic, non-hazardous, everything. But the point is to use enough of it so it does what it's supposed to, and not to use too much of it. And we use the solvents, the lean part, to kind of control how much oil is in that liquid. So our lean medium is half oil, half solvent. Our fat medium is the same thing, but has a little bit of resin in it, a little bit of Damar resin, which will make it a little bit shinier and a little bit stickier. So for example, if you're glazing, or doing a thin layer. Has anyone ever had this happen where you dilute a layer with some oil or some medium and it won't stick to the surface, it beads up? Well, at that point, that means the surface of the painting is probably closed up, it's not absorbent anymore. So having a little bit of resin in it makes it sticky and it will grip and hold on to the surface. So at that point, it's the same amount of fatness as the lean because it has the same oil content, 50%, but texture-wise, it will grip a little bit more. And since you have 50% oil content, that resin will get embedded in the oil, just like pigment gets embedded in the oil and becomes permanent. The issues you have with using too much resin or varnish in your painting has more to do with not having enough oil content. So if you use a medium, if you use varnish alone as a medium, and you thin the paint down so much, you're thinning it down with so much solvent that's in the varnish that there's not enough oil to bind both the pigment and the resin. But as a slight addition to the oil to make it have stickier qualities, that's been documented since again the 15th century. They really were very concerned with the qualities of the oil, making it stick. And again, for people who are doing glazing in many layers, that's important. And as Rick was saying, on a pigment painting, if you're doing a sketch, some people like it to be a little bit tackier. Maybe they'll put a first layer in very quickly. They like it to set up. Then it has its qualities that you can use. So that's why we're very much dealing with oils, solvents, and resins as just basic elements that you're, ingredients that you're adjusting for your usage. Does that make sense?
I see what you're saying. You're using the spike oil instead of the container of the turpentine.
Yes.
And you're using the brush cleaner when you're done.
Right.
So
Right.
you're using the spike oil
As an
along
additive.
with the colors on top of the gesso when you're painting.
Yes.
It doesn't make it shinier. It's just a substitute for the
It's the substitute for odorless mineral spirits and turpentine.
Right.
Initially, before it evaporates, it will be shiny. But once it evaporates, it's just like any water you put on your skin's gonna look shiny. The second the water's gone, the shine's gone. So that's
Well, gesso is shiny.
gesso can be shiny, and it depends.
Yeah, once this evaporates, if there's shine in your picture, it's because of the oil content, not because of the spike. Spike is once it evaporates, it's gone. Once it's just like turpentine or odorless mineral spirits. Once it's out, it's in the air. It's not on the picture.
And anything that's liquefied is shiny.
That's true. It's still wet, obviously. Unless, well, I've had circumstances where I've bought canvases that were maybe a little bit too smooth, or I'm not sure what was used to make it, but where I painted and almost immediately it sucks all the oil out of the paint, and the paint's matte, and even though the paint's not even near being dry, I just avoid those canvases when I've learned to recognize them when I see a very smooth canvas, that when I touch it, it feels like it's pulling oil out of my finger. I just avoid those. All sorts of problems.
Also, palette knife it and give it a contour too. If it becomes too shiny like that, you see, and then you will just.
If the ground is too shiny,
Yeah.
I guess you could sand it.
When oil grounds get old, sometimes you get this feeling like the surface, like oil rises up, kind of. And you could sand that, but be careful about
So then
knowing
you
what that
wouldn't
ground
want
is
to take
before you
off the top
aspirate
layer if
that
you're using
dust.
palette knife paint. Because
Of the ground?
So, as you said, some of it, you can take off the top layer of it. but
No,
if
that was with the
you-
varnishes.
But if you're palette knife painting, you're going to need a medium anyway.
Right. Usually, if you're painting pretty thickly, regardless of the medium, you're not going to have adhesion problems because the paint will be ground.
And if you're painting with a palette knife, generally speaking, you don't do a lot of passes.
You could put some of that. You could mix the paints. If you're doing that with odorless petroleum mineral spirits or turpentine, you could use the spike or even some of the brush. We would just say is that if you're used to using odorless petroleum mineral spirits, since it's such a weak acting solvent, then you probably break down the paint probably a bit faster than the OMS does, which is what people are used to. Other questions? All right, then we can get to the smelling part. So people can see, all right, so we're going to pass around the spike, which is the strong smelling one. So all our varnishes, the retouch and the damar, you can pass that around carefully.
A retouch varnish is something that you use when you're working on a painting and maybe you're not finished with the painting, but it's dried back quite a bit. You've got some sinking in. So you've got maybe the beginning of an issue with oil or oil sinking in and the painting becomes matte, right? And when it's matte, you can't see the color. So if you try to paint on that without bringing the color back, you're probably going to mix the color wrong. Let's say that you're going to paint in an area and it's got a particular brown quality. When you're trying to remix it on your palette, you're going to wind up mixing it to that matte quality. Then when you varnish it at some later date, those colors are going to change. They're going to be different from each other. So you would use the retouch varnish to bring it back to the color that it was when it was wet, so that you can color match accurately. And the final varnish is the one that we were talking about before, about having to wait a considerable amount of time before you varnish it, based on the type of thing you get around. Whereas retouch, the whole purpose of retouch is to skirt that issue. It's something that can go on, as long as you don't put on a crazy layer of it. It should be put on relatively thin. You don't want to be creating layers between your painting between your layers of your painting. You don't want a layer of the mark, because that will guarantee you separate the crack and fall off the picture.
So now,
You will mix the brush cleaner with the soap bar as you're sudsing?
no, we're gonna demonstrate brush cleaning, and we'll explain that thoroughly. Thank you so much. And then this is the citrus one, which is the other brush cleaning solvent for orange rides. And you can pass that around.
I've used this for cleaning my brushes, and it's amazing to me the way how quickly the pigment precipitates out of the hairs of the brush.
This palette that was kindly donated by the store. We're gonna get a brush dirty with some paints, and then we're gonna demonstrate kind of swirling it around in the solvent for the sake of. Thank you so much. Sorry. All right. So most people have something like this. Cleaning their brush with solvent. So just to show you. It gets cleaned much faster.
Better than the old serpentine.
It cleans a lot faster.
Oh, yeah.
Way faster. You would do that with your brushes at the end of the day. Is just swirl it around, get all the excess off so all the liquid goes back in. Then afterwards, if you got a jar or a cup or something with warm water and the soap, which we don't have, they sell it here, but we just have a sample bar here. Normally it's sold twice the size. You basically swirl it around in warm water, swirl it around in this, keep doing it until you're getting white suds. When you get white suds, you know that you've gotten all the pigment out. After that, rinse it in warm water and then squeeze it out until there's no more suds. And that way you know you've gotten all the soap out. But the brush hairs would have absorbed the olive oil in here, just like, again, people's hair to keep it from getting dry. And then you can shape it, and it should last longer because the hairs will be constantly re-moisturized. So the solvent takes out the drying oil, the resins, the things that are drying in the ferrule, and it does the major part of the cleaning. And then the soap and water is really to moisturize the hairs and get out any remaining particles.
Pay close attention to the ferrule when you're putting the solvent in the brush and when you're soaking it up. That's where the brush will fail. That's where the age of the brush will be shortened. If there's still color at the ferrule, that's going to dry. It's going to then allow more pigment to get caught in there, and eventually your brush hair will splay out and then be useless.
And also, cherries here is has the best prices for our stuff that I've seen. Yeah, take as much as you take them all. Sure. If you have any questions, you can always contact us with contact information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Take care.
Thank you.